Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming to today's webinar and joining us for our compassionate conversations. Today, you will learn how to respond and support a survivor when they disclose a sexual assault. Please introduce yourself and what organization or place of work you are from in our chat. Any questions throughout the webinar can be submitted into the Q&A section or the feature of the Zoom webinar. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of our presentation. For those who require interpretation, Hema Chacon, community educator at the Blue Bench, will be providing a Spanish translation of today's presentation. To join her interpretation, please see the bottom banner of your Zoom meeting, click more, and find the interpretation feature next to the globe icon. You will then be able to hear Hema and have the option to mute the English audio. With this, please welcome our host, Katie Gray, Community Education Director, Angelica Hoyle, Co-Director of Client Services Clinical, and Hema Chacon, Community Educator.
Hi, my name is Katie Gray. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Community Education Director at the Blue Bench. The Blue Bench is a community of survivors, allies, and advocates working to prevent sexual violence and build a safe, supportive Metro Denver. We work collaboratively to provide accessible, survivor-centered support services and empowering education. I've been with the Blue Bench for almost 3 years in various roles, and I hold a master's degree in educational psychology and have dedicated my career to nonprofit training and education. I am deeply passionate about sexual violence prevention and very committed to the Blue Bench's mission. It's really wonderful to see so many community members here today, united in our effort to support our community with passion and care for survivors of sexual violence.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angelica Hoyle. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the co-director of client services overseeing the clinical team at the Blue Bench. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I joined the Blue Bench 6 years ago as a graduate intern. Since then, I've worked as a member of the clinical team, providing trauma-focused therapy services to survivors of sexual violence. Thanks for joining us today.
At the Blue Bench, we take a community-wide approach to preventing and addressing sexual violence. We believe that preventing and responding to sexual violence is a shared community responsibility. So thank you all for joining us today in support of that mission and that responsibility. With cultural messages around sexual violence and accountability shifting, it's more important than ever to stay committed to this critical work. We also know that the way that someone responds to a survivor's disclosure, especially if they're the first person that a survivor is confiding in, that can have a lasting impact. And a supportive response can encourage the survivor to seek further help and share their experience with others.
So let's dive in with our agenda for today. We're going to start off with a little bit of information about the Blue Bench, and then we're going to move into some understanding sexual violence, themes like consent, and the impact of sexual violence before moving into some reporting barriers and consequences. A little bit later today, we'll focus on trauma and trauma responses, and specifically how you can support a survivor that discloses to you. At the end, we'll have time for some Q&A. So just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A feature if any questions come up throughout the presentation. Please take care of yourself throughout this webinar. We're going to be covering very heavy topics today, such as sexual violence, mental health issues, self-harm, and disordered eating. If you need to step away or take a moment to engage in self-care, please feel free to do so. Our hotline is available if you need support, and the number is listed at the bottom of every slide. Please note, today's presentation is meant to provide information about supporting adult survivors of sexual violence, which may look a little bit different than supporting survivors who are minors. If you're interested in learning more about supporting minors who've experienced sexual assault, we'll share some information when we talk about our community education programs.
I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Blue Bench in general and how we support survivors. So the Blue Bench is Denver metro area's only comprehensive sexual assault prevention and care center. We offer immediate response with a 24-hour sexual assault hotline, which is on the bottom of every slide here, as well as resource navigation in English and Spanish, where we can help connect community members to services internally and externally, such as therapy or legal services, things like financial coaching or trauma-informed yoga. And we also offer hospital advocacy and accompaniment for those who have experienced an assault and choose to go to the hospital and may want someone there with them to support them. Hospital advocates can be requested either through our hotline or at the hospital itself. We also offer a continuum of care for ages 13 and up, which includes individual therapy, group therapy, as well as secondary survivor workshops called Someone I Love, which you will be hearing some of the information that is provided in that workshop here today. And then also case management, which is long-term support and accompaniment as folks navigate the various systems that they may encounter after assault, such as the criminal legal system, the civil legal system, and various other agencies and resources. And then we have community education, which is evidence-based and developmentally appropriate workshops for students from middle school through adulthood. We offer Uniting in Action, which is a program for high school students, which was created along with experts and high school students about focusing on bystander intervention. Then we have less talk about it for middle school students. Safe bars for alcohol serving establishments, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in depth later. And then SHIELD, which is an anti-sexual harassment in the workplace workshop for corporations and businesses. We offer Knowledge is Power, which is a 1-hour overview of sexual violence impact and scope for all community members. And then Youth Empowerment and Safety, which is for parents and youth serving professionals to learn how to recognize and prevent child sexual abuse. If you want to learn more about these programs or how to book one in your community, you can visit our website or email preed@thebluebench.org. And currently, we are offering most of our prevention programs free of charge.
So, what is sexual assault? While terms such as rape and sexual assault are often used interchangeably when referring to sexual violence, when we use the term sexual assault, we're talking about any form of sexual contact which occurs without a person's consent. At the Blue Bench, we honor and mirror the term that a survivor chooses to use when speaking about their own experience. Sexual assault occurs when someone has sexual contact without consent. We'll go a little bit deeper into consent later on, but know that penetration is not required for an act to be considered sexual assault. Sexual assault is all about power and control. It's not about sex or sexual desire. From the perspective of the survivor, the assault bears no resemblance to the act of sex. Sexual assault is an experience involving terror and fear of bodily harm or even death. Drug-facilitated sexual assault occurs when substances are intentionally used to make somebody unable to consent. Common substances can include alcohol, illegal drugs, date rape drugs like Rohypnol or GHB, or over-the-counter medications that can cause drowsiness.
We know that alcohol alone is the most common substance used to facilitate sexual assault, and alcohol is involved in over 50% of sexual assaults. And of all reported drug-facilitated sexual assaults, alcohol comprised 96%, with only 4% being other drugs like GHB or Rohypnol. It's really important to remember that alcohol does not cause sexual assault. Only perpetrators cause sexual assault. Perpetrators use alcohol as a weapon to facilitate sexual violence by incapacitating their targets and camouflaging their behavior. Messages that imply that a survivor wouldn't be assaulted if they weren't drinking are very dangerous, victim-blaming and shaming narratives. If someone ever does disclose to you that alcohol was involved in their assault, it's very important to remind them that if they were drinking alcohol, it was not their fault that they were assaulted. The only thing that a person consents to when drinking is the possibility of having a hangover or headache the next day. It does not matter how a person was behaving. They will not be sexually assaulted if a perpetrator does not choose to harm them. And with all other violent crimes, being drunk is not a defense or an excuse. If someone was blackout drunk and then robbed a bank, they're still going to be prosecuted for robbing that bank. Because of the relationship between alcohol and sexual assault, the Blue Bench provides our Safe Bars training, who we partner with the national organization Safe Bars to provide training to alcohol serving and hospitality establishments. Our Safe Bar training trains hospitality industry professionals to stop sexual aggression and other forms of violence through 3 distinct programs, which are active bystander skills, allyship skills, and de-escalation skills. To learn more about this program, again, you can visit our website. Now we're going to talk a little bit about consent, because understanding consent is a very important part of understanding sexual assault and how to support survivors. This is a concept map covering all of the different elements of consent that must be present in order for consent to be present. So consent is permission. It's permission that must be asked for. And when it's asked for, it must be met with an enthusiastic agreement, an enthusiastic yes, something that cannot be confused for anything other than a yes, not a maybe. Any uncertainty is a no. A lot of times we teach people consent by saying no means no, but a better way to say it is really yes means yes, because the absence of no is not a yes. So an enthusiastic agreement and yes means yes. Consent has to be present. For it to be present, there needs to be equal power between all participants and free will. Free will meaning that people are consenting without the fear of a negative consequence or the promise of a reward. It is a mutual agreement that is clearly communicated between all parties for specific named activities and for each new activity. It is the initiator's responsibility to make sure that consent is there and to ask the permission. It needs to be present every single time, and it can be withdrawn at any time. We include this concept map in a resource guide that we'll send following this webinar for you to share with other community members or learn more about it yourself. So there's also a number of times when consent is not possible. Consent is not possible when force, pressure, coercion, manipulation, trickery, or threats are present. As discussed earlier, it is not possible if someone is incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol, or when someone is asleep or unconscious. When someone has an intellectual or developmental disability that renders them unable to judge the nature of what's being asked of them, consent is also not possible. This is not to say that anyone that has an intellectual or developmental disability cannot consent to sex or cannot have healthy sex lives. It just means that they need to be able to understand what sex is, what the sexual act is, and what is being asked of them in order to consent. And then finally, consent is not possible if we are outside of the ages of consent. Many survivors may struggle with feelings of guilt or confusion, especially if they were manipulated or coerced. And coercion is the most powerful tool for gaining compliance, with only 11% of overall rape and sexual assault incidents involving a weapon. Understanding consent reinforces what happened was not their fault. Abuse occurs because someone ignored or violated their boundaries, not because of anything they did. Consent education encourages a culture where survivors are believed, supported, and respected, rather than being blamed or dismissed. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the scope and the far-reaching impact of sexual violence. It is an extremely widespread issue. And everyone attending here today likely knows someone who has experienced some form of sexual violence or may have experienced it themselves. We know that every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. And understanding the scope of sexual violence and the barriers that survivors face is essential for providing that meaningful support. So I'm going to go over a few statistics. 1 in 2 women and 1 in 2 trans or non-binary individuals and 1 in 3 men will experience contact sexual violence in their lifetime. Contact sexual violence refers to any unwanted sexual touching. When we want to talk about more specific types of sexual violence, the numbers change. So we want to take a minute to talk about the statistics associated specifically with rape. FBI defines rape as the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So When we're talking about rape, 1 in 4 or 25% of women will experience rape in their lifetime. And for men, it is 1 in 26 or about 4%. This is low in part because of the way that rape is defined and how statistics are measured. When we also count men who have been forced to penetrate someone else, the number goes up to being more closer to 1 in 10 or 10%. Sexual violence does not affect populations equally. Marginalized populations like women, young people, or racial and sexual minorities often face higher rates of abuse due to systemic inequalities, societal power imbalances, and a greater likelihood of being dismissed or disbelieved when they report. Women of color are impacted by sexual violence at higher rates than white women, and Native American women are particularly vulnerable and are twice as likely to experience sexual violence compared to people of other races. People with disabilities are at significantly higher risk of sexual violence than people without disabilities, being about 3 or 4 times more likely to experience sexual violence. And more than 4 in 5 rape victims were under the age of 25 the first time they were assaulted, and more of half of them were under 18. So this means that young people are one of the groups that are at highest risk for sexual violence. The likelihood of someone experiencing sexual violence increases when people have multiple marginalized identities, such as young trans women of color. I want to be very clear that just because someone has a marginalized identity does not mean that they will experience sexual violence, but rather these identities experience violence and sexual violence at higher rates. Now I'm going to talk a little about reporting and the barriers to reporting and the consequences of these barriers. Understanding the barriers and consequences of reporting sexual assault is very crucial to providing that compassionate and effective support to survivors. Many survivors will face fear and stigma, self-blame, or mistrust of institutions, making that decision to report incredibly difficult. Even those who do report can encounter victim blaming, inadequate support, or systemic failures, which can further traumatize them. The reality of reporting injustice in sexual assault cases is really alarming. More than 2/3 of sexual assaults are never reported to the police, and only 2.5% of perpetrators are ever incarcerated. So to look at this numbers a little more clearly, out of 1,000 sexual assaults that occur, only 310 will be reported to police. 50 of those reports will lead to an arrest of the perpetrator, and only 25% of those will lead to incarceration. These low reporting and incarceration rates have serious social consequences. Most perpetrators do not face accountability, and research shows us that those who commit sexual violence often do so repeatedly. On average, a perpetrator will commit 6 sexual assaults. There are a lot of very common barriers that people face after experiencing sexual violence, and these barriers are partially what contribute to the low number of reports and the low number of perpetrators that face legal consequences. Recognizing these challenges allows us to offer non-judgmental support, empower survivors in their choices for reporting, and advocate for improved systems that prioritize survivors' safety and well-being. So first, I'm going to talk about isolation and intimidation. Survivors of sexual violence often experience feelings of isolation and intimidation. Many may struggle with self-blame, even though, as I will say time and time again, the responsibility for sexual assault always lies with the perpetrator. And as a society, we need to continue to reinforce this message that perpetrators are the only ones to blame. Research shows us that 80% of sexual assault survivors know their attacker, and about 1/3 are assaulted by a romantic or intimate partner. For children, that's closer to about 93% of abusers are known to them. Because sexual violence is so frequently committed by someone familiar, survivors may feel not being believed, facing other social consequences, threats from their attacker, or harm coming to their attacker. And these fears can lead to that silence and intimidation and to further isolation. So we can work on breaking this cycle by shedding light on this issue, normalizing conversations about sexual violence, especially that it is often committed by someone that is known to survivors, and acknowledging that their fear and isolation validates their experiences. We can help rebuild the trust and empower them to seek help when they're ready. In American society, victim blaming is rooted in deep-seated cultural beliefs, social conditioning, and also psychological defense mechanisms. Rape culture, internalized misogyny, and gender norms continue to reinforce many harmful victim blaming myths. For example, the idea that a survivor's actions, such as what they were doing, what they were drinking, what they were wearing, somehow caused the assault. This gives people a false sense of control and helps to reinforce the belief that certain behaviors can either prevent or lead to sexual violence. Furthermore, the discomfort with sexual violence makes it easier to blame survivors rather than confront the reality that most assaults were committed by trusted individuals. Additionally, legal and historical biases have long scrutinized the survivors more than the perpetrators and their actions, while media portrayals continue to question victims' credibility, and institutions also minimize sexual violence to protect those in power. Breaking this cycle requires education, cultural change, and policies that hold perpetrators accountable while supporting survivors, and we must reframe this conversation to place the responsibility firmly where it belongs on the perpetrator. So by challenging these victim blaming attitudes, we can reassure survivors that they're not at fault and create a more supportive space where they can feel believed and empowered to heal. Many survivors hesitate to report sexual assault due to fears of being re-traumatized by the law enforcement or the courts or other institutions. The reporting process can be very invasive and exhausting, often involving intrusive questions, victim blaming, lengthy legal battles, and even retaliation, making it feel as distressing as the assault itself. Even when survivors do come forward, there is no guarantee that the perpetrator will face consequences, and cases are frequently dismissed due to insufficient evidence, and district attorneys may decline to prosecute if they believe that the case is unwinnable, sometimes to avoid that further traumatizing of the survivor. When cases do proceed, perpetrators often receive lenient sentences, particularly if they are perceived at having promising futures. Biases within the criminal justice system also contribute to these challenges, and perpetrators intentionally target individuals who are less likely to be believed, and those in positions of power or influence may evade accountability entirely. Recognizing these barriers is essential to providing survivors with compassionate, informed support and advocating for a system that prioritizes their well-being and rights.
So, what is trauma? Trauma is an event outside of the normal range of experience. In order for an experience to be considered traumatic, the survivor must perceive the experience to be a credible threat of death or serious injury. And trauma causes psychological overwhelm for survivors. Specific trauma responses can vary really greatly on a bunch of different factors, including an individual's resiliency, their ability to cope, and their ability to regulate their emotions. Trauma really destroys one's previous understanding of themselves, others, and the world. So, there are 4 responses that are triggered when somebody experiences a traumatic event. There are the fight and flight responses, which are sympathetic nervous system responses, which look really like fighting back against an attacker or fleeing from an attacker. There's also the freeze response, which is a parasympathetic nervous response, which looks like playing dead to avoid further harm. And in some cases, a person who has experienced trauma may learn that appeasing their attacker may protect them from further harm. The fawn response is more of a physiological response where an individual is reading the social and emotional cues of others to tend to and care for their needs. Without getting too much into the neurobiology of trauma, I'd like to provide a little bit of context for what's happening inside of the brain when somebody experiences a traumatic event. This helps us support survivors as we're better able to understand what they are experiencing during a traumatic event and after. So when the brain perceives a threat, it goes through a checklist of sorts to get the person to safety. This checklist happens faster than you could even think the word checklist, but I'm going to slow it down so that you can get a better idea of the process. So the first step that the brain will take will be to determine if it's possible to escape the danger. This is the flight response. The person's sympathetic nervous system floods the system with activating hormones to try and get it out of danger. This is like stepping on the gas pedal to accelerate. Next, if the brain determines fleeing is not possible, it will check to see if the person can fight their way out of the dangerous situation. Again, the person's sympathetic nervous system will flood the system with activating hormones, further pressing on the gas. If the brain determines fighting is not possible, the parasympathetic nervous system steps in and floods the system with inhibiting hormones. This is like slamming your foot down on the brake. When pressing on both the gas and the brake will always win and stop the car. That's what's happening when somebody is experiencing a freeze response. The energy is high, but outside it's frozen. So getting a little bit more into the freeze response. The freeze response is an attempt to survive a threat by freezing or playing dead. Again, this is an inactivated response triggered by the parasympathetic nervous system. Characteristics of this freeze response include the body becoming immobile or frozen, dissociation or psychologically checking out, and little to no memory of the event itself. The freeze response is adaptive for survival. It's automatic. It is not a conscious choice, and it's a very common response to sexual assault. Now, the fawn response is a trauma-related coping mechanism where someone tries to avoid conflict by pleasing others. It's also known as people-pleasing or appeasing, and it develops in childhood, especially if the person experienced emotional or physical abuse, or in situations of interpersonal violence, such as domestic violence, sexual assault, or abductions. When we look at the common trauma responses after a sexual assault, we see things like coping and behavioral responses such as tension-reducing behaviors, which are attempts to manage distress, which include substance use, self-harm such as cutting, burning, scratching, or hitting oneself, disordered eating, for example, eating more than usual to cope or eating much less than usual. Disordered eating is a form of taking control over one's body, which can make sense following a traumatic event, which is a loss of control. We may also see things like risky sexual behavior or sudden mood shifts, things like sadness, depression, anger, or irritability. We may also see identity and relationship challenges. We may see a survivor feeling numb, checked out, or disconnected from their self and from others. They may have an impaired sense of self. They may experience lower self-esteem than prior to the assault and feelings of emptiness. They may experience shame, guilt, or self-blame. And they may have problems with trust and/or sexual intimacy. Survivors often experience guilt, self-blame, and shame because of having the freeze or fawn response. We might hear someone say things like, "I let it happen," "I should have run away," "I should have fought back," or "I didn't yell or scream or ask for help." What you can do is remind the survivor that a trauma response is automatic, it's not a choice, and it helped them survive a dangerous situation. When supporting the survivor, assure the survivor that their real options during the event were extremely limited. That's a way to respond to self-blame. Everything they did during that event was aimed at helping them to survive. You can try these statements of support. "I'm glad you're alive. I'm sorry that this happened. It's not your fault. You did the best that you could." Avoid any victim-blaming language around their actions or their trust of a person who caused them harm. Now we're going to take a look at the 3 E's: empathy, empowerment, and education. We'll start off with empathetic responses. It's very important to try and have an empathetic response when someone makes a disclosure of sexual violence. Active listening, tone, and the language that you use when responding will shape that person's experience and may impact how they choose to disclose to others and whether they get additional support that they may need. What you can do is just listen without judgment or interruption. You can allow them to share as much or as little as they want. You can remember that you don't need to fix it investigate it, or make them feel better immediately. Avoid providing unsolicited advice or making judgmental statements or minimizing their experience by saying things like, "At least you didn't do this," or "It could have been worse." You can validate their feelings. There's no right way to feel. You can be available for them physically and emotionally, or when they need somebody for support. You can be patient. Healing can take a long time. It may seem like somebody is getting better and then take a step backwards. Healing isn't linear, and this is the process. It's okay to check in regularly over time. Some examples of empathetic responses include, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. You didn't deserve this, and it's not your fault. Thank you for trusting me with this. I believe you. I can't imagine how painful this must be, but you're not alone. I'm here for you and I'll support you in whatever way you need. And how can I help? I can just listen, help you find resources, or simply sit with you. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." The next of our 3 E's is empower. You can empower a survivor by reminding them of their strengths and their coping abilities. You can ask, "What can I do for you?" or "How can I help?" You can respect needs for distance, privacy, and boundaries. You can ask permission to touch them or to ask questions about the event or about their experience. You can maintain confidentiality and not share their story without their consent. And you can respect their autonomy. Give them the ability to choose what they want to do next. Let them decide. Instead of saying, "You have to report this," ask, "Would you like to talk about what you want to do next?" Support their choices, whether or not they decide to take legal action. Healing or justice may not look the same for every survivor. Let them take the lead on what's right for them. Some examples of empowering responses include, "You are incredibly strong for sharing this with me. I want you to know that you are in control of what happens next. However you choose to move forward, I will support you. You've survived something incredibly difficult, and that speaks to your resilience. I trust you to know what's best for you, and I'm here to support you in whatever way feels right for you. I want you to feel safe in sharing. You never have to tell me more than you're comfortable with, and I will always keep what you share between us." Keep in mind, if a child or a minor is disclosing, you cannot always promise confidentiality, especially if you are a mandatory reporter.
Perhaps one of the most important things you can do if a survivor discloses to you that they experience sexual violence is to believe them. The vast majority, 92 to 98% of reported sexual assaults are people who are telling the truth, and the rate of false reports for sexual violence is similar to that of other violent crimes. Yet survivors of sexual violence face far more scrutiny and skepticism. Reporting is already a very traumatic event and a difficult process. Many survivors hesitate to come forward due to those fears we discussed of being dismissed, disbelieved, or re-traumatized. And it's very unlikely that someone's going to subject themselves to this experience by falsely accusing another person. Additionally, challenging this harmful myth is essential. Believing survivors should be our default response, not questioning their honesty. It's not our role to doubt or investigate. Rather, our role is to offer support, and simply just saying, "I believe you," can make a very profound difference. The final E in our 3 E's is educate or education. So educating yourself about sexual violence, its impact, the trauma responses is a really important first step, and everyone here today is already doing that. So use this knowledge that you gather to help support survivors. Use your knowledge about consent, about barriers to reporting, and the effects to trauma to help normalize their emotions and the reactions. If they ask for support, then you can assist them in problem solving and providing helpful resources. Here are some responses that educate. You are not responsible for what happened. Only the person who hurt you is. Consent must be freely given, and if you were scared, pressured, or unable to say no, that still means there was no consent and you didn't do anything wrong. Many people experience a freeze response during trauma. It's the brain's way of trying to protect you. Not fighting back doesn't mean that you allowed or wanted what happened. Your body reacted in a way that helps you survive. It's common to question what happened, but the truth is, if someone ignored your boundaries, they were in the wrong, not you. Now, I'd like to go over some resources that you can offer someone who has experienced sexual violence. It can be really hard to know what to do, and there are a lot of people out there that can help. Here's information about the Blue Bench's resources specifically. You can share this with someone who is seeking answers or support after an assault. There are also resources for secondary survivors who want to learn how to support a friend or a loved one. If you want to take a snap or a screenshot of these resources, go ahead and do so. We are also going to send all of these resources in a guide following this webinar to everyone who attended so that you can have those with you. Here are some more additional resources outside of the Blue Bench that may be helpful for supporting someone who has experienced sexual assault. And again, we want to validate that it can be really difficult to know what to do after experiencing or witnessing the effects of sexual violence, but no one is alone and there is a lot of help available. We have gone over a lot of information in like the past 40 minutes, and we hope that some of it has been able to help you learn that your response really shapes how a survivor processes their experience, and that a supportive response can help them feel believed and validated, while a dismissive or skeptical response can really deepen those feelings of shame or isolation and lessen their likelihood to tell others or to seek further support. So while you're trying to absorb all the information from today, I want to suggest that if you remember only 3 things from today, if someone discloses to you that they experienced sexual violence, remember these 3 things. Remember to say, I believe you, so they know that they are not doubted, that their experience is valid, and that they feel safe. It will help combat the guilt and shame that can come from living in a society that often blames and doubts survivors of sexual violence. Tell them it's not your fault, to help them let go of that self-blame and remind them that the responsibility is only on the perpetrator. And then finally ask, how can I help? This helps empower them. It's especially important after the disempowering experience of a sexual assault, and also helps maintain their autonomy and reassures them that you will be there for them.
Thank you, Katie, Angelica, and Hema, for a thorough and informative presentation. We'd like to remind you, before we answer questions, that April is Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. This month, you can help the Blue Bench fundraise for our survivor support services by visiting local businesses and enjoying their SAPM Give Back specials. We also would like to invite everyone to visit our Rise Survivor Art Show at M&D Artistries on Santa Fe. Throughout the month of April. If you're unable to attend in person, we do feature a virtual gallery. For more information on SAPM deals and the Rise Survivor Art Show, you can find that on our website, thebluebench.org. Please join us for our June webinar on serving and supporting LGBTQ survivors, how intersections on identity impact vulnerability. We'll be sharing more information as we get closer, so keep an eye out on social media and in your inboxes. Thank you all again for taking time to participate in our webinar. We will now answer questions that were dropped in the Q&A feature. Okay. Sorry. We just have one question. So how should my response shift if I'm the very first person they call and I'm with them immediately after the assault?
I think that's a really great question. I'm happy to answer that if that's okay. Great. Okay. I think that's a really great question. I think in a lot of ways, your response is going to be relying on these same principles, right? Empathizing, empowering them to make a decision that feels right for them about whether it feels like they would like to go to the hospital to do a SANE exam, or if they don't feel like that process is the right choice for them. I think empowering them to make the decision that feels the best and the most safe for them at this time is the best thing that you can do. And I think being able to share resources so that they are empowered to make their own decisions about what their healing journey will look like is something really meaningful you can do for them.
We'll wait a few more minutes to see if there's more questions, but this is a survey about things about today's webinar and what you would like to see more from our community engagement team. If you could please take a minute to fill out this short survey, it would be very greatly appreciated by our team to help us continue to try to find funding to provide these services that is increasingly difficult.
Someone did ask, can we get copies of the slide?
That feels like a Katie question.
Well, what we did is we compiled a lot of the information that we hope are the key takeaways and are going to be sending that out in a resource guide. If there's specific information that you want to hear more about or have further details on, I'd ask that you just reply to that and we can get that to you.
There was an additional question in the chat. Somebody asked, should we contact cops if they need that support?
I think that did you say contact cops?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that the decision to contact the police needs to be one that is made by the survivor, unless it is a minor. Again, how you're going to respond is going to be different if the person is a minor, but in general, that is going to really greatly depend upon the history and the identity and what's going on with the individual who experienced the assault. So certainly I would support someone in calling the police if they wanted that support and asked for help with doing that. But I would definitely not do that unless that was something that their survivor asked for or wanted. And again, if it is a child or a minor and they are in immediate danger, you are definitely going to want to call 911 and also the child protective services in the county that you're in or that the abuse is taking place in, but that's going to look a lot different for someone that is an adult. Does that answer your question?
I think so. That actually leads us into another question. So somebody did ask, what is the best way to support my adult son who recently told me, his mom, that his father, or that my father, sexually abused him when he was a small child?
I think that following those E's and those would be the best course for that. Being able to reassure them that they are believed and that it's not their fault, that nothing that ever happened to them is going to change the way that you feel about them or what your relationship is going to look like. I think that with children, whether they're children who are reporting when they're children or children that choose to report later as adults, to trusted individuals, a lot of that has to do with fears that may have been intentionally instilled by the abuser, that people won't believe them or that it's going to change the way that people feel about them. So really focusing on that belief that your feelings for him don't change. I would also recommend getting support for yourself, because there may be feelings that come up again around sort of guilt or shame that you can definitely address and remember to help remind you that the perpetrators are the only one to blame. So calling our resource line, calling our hotline, talking to advocates yourself to get support that you need, and attending our Someone I Love workshop. Angelica,
Yeah.
you have something.
I will also name, I see Kelly Connor added in the chat to connect with Wings. Wings Foundation is wonderful and would be a really excellent resource for you. And I would highly recommend taking a look at that website. Yeah, but I agree with everything you said, Katie.
Another question we have is, do you offer training on how to respond to reports of sexual harassment in a non-work environment? Any suggestions or insights to offer right now?
Yeah, we do. That's a good question. I think that on all of our programs, we touch a little bit on like reporting options. Although we don't have a specific program for sexual harassment outside of work, I would say that our SHIELD program applies to sexual harassment, where that's happening, whether or not it's at work or not. Although our Shield program will focus like a little bit more specifically on legal obligations that people have around sexual harassment, but we very much also focus on like things that create a culture of respect, which will apply anywhere that someone is experiencing harassment. And again, our knowledge is power, or a sexual violence 101 would be what I would recommend for that, which highlights all of the sort of key topics from all of our larger, more in-depth programs. And we're also always willing to tailor programs for specific needs. So if there's a specific program that people want, like for instance, this webinar was tailored based off of Knowledge is Power and Someone I Love, and all of our programs, I would love to hear from you and hear about what you want. And it's possible that we have curriculum that we can tailor for you. And I am interested in creating programs that are responsive to what community members need.
Next question would be, if you are a mandatory reporter, how can you respond with empathy but still empower them to do it themselves?
You mean to report themselves?
That's a good question. I will start with kind of how I interact with my my clients. I like to remind folks that I'm a mandated reporter whenever information is being disclosed to me. So when I am completing an intake or meeting with a client for the first time, of course, I'm reminding them that I'm a mandated reporter. But also if it's feeling like we're kind of getting into a mandatory reporting zone, like if something is shared with me that it feels like, ooh, if I had a little bit more information, I would be required to report this. I actually tend to like pause my clients in a as polite a way as possible. I do like to let them know like, hey, it feels like we're getting to a point where I may be required to make a report just based on my mandate, based on the information that you're sharing with me. And I want you to have choice in what is being reported and if you want to share that information with me. Now, mind you, I typically am working with adults, so it looks a little bit different than working with children. But I do try to invite choice in that process as much as possible so that they know that if they share more information with me, I will be making a report. I just think that that helps to empower them in the process. And if they have any questions about that or any questions about what reporting might look like, or even some kind of like pros or cons for themselves about whether they'd like to report, I'm always happy to share information with them.
And I'll say that if you're a mandatory reporter and you have enough information that abuse is taking place, you don't really have a choice legally or ethically to not report that. But to be able to, depending upon the developmental age of the child, include them as much as possible. So like making sure that you're ensuring their safety, but maybe telling them like never promising that you're going to keep it as to yourself, but saying like, hey, I may need to tell someone to help keep you safe, but I'm going to let you know everything I'm doing. And if they're older, then you can invite them to maybe be there while you make the call yourselves and say, hey, like, do you want to go do this together? Offer them the options of being able to make the call. And just, you could say, hey, do you have questions? Do you want to write down your questions? What do you want to know about this report? And that's how you can make sure that you're really empowering them to be part of the decision. Because I know it can be really hard and we can feel like possibly we're doing more harm by making that mandatory report. So I understand that feeling, but there are ways to be able to involve the young person to keep them empowering them. And I agree with Angelica, as soon as you get into that area where it feels like you're getting a disclosure, to make sure that you remind them of your position as a mandatory reporter so that they can choose what to disclose and when.
Thank you. This one is kind of a two-parter. First part would be, should I still report a child sexual assault if I'm not a mandated reporter? And the second part of this question is, how do you respond to someone that reports child-on-child sexual assault?
Okay, so we know that like 40% of child sex abuse takes place by an older or more powerful youth. So it's kind of a less recognized form of abuse, but it is really important to be able, you would want to report that the same way that you would report adult child sexual abuse. And what was the first question? The first part of the question?
Oh,
Oh, I'm not a mandated reporter. So, I mean, that is going to be something that I think is up to you as a person, to decide for yourself, like sort of your ethical or your moral responsibility to report that. And there's going to probably be a lot of factors at play there. I think that that could also be something that you could call a confidential hotline about to discuss your options without having, and as long as you're not disclosing details, they're not going to have to mandate report. So you could walk through options with someone else to sort of help make that decision. And again, it is really important to still report, and it is still a mandatory report to report any youth, older or more powerful youth, or child and child sexual abuse.
thank you. Though so far, no additional questions, but we can leave it open for another minute. We have about 5 minutes left in this webinar. Angelica.
I think I see one that says, would it be different if it's not a work environment? As far as and I believe that's referring to
I've always wondered that too, if I'm a mandatory reporter.
No,
And
it's a really good question. And I would urge anybody that is a mandatory reporter to take a look at their the laws in their state. From what I remember when I last looked, I don't actually think that Colorado specifies whether you are required to report in a personal sense if you are a mandatory reporter professionally. And I know that that can feel like a little weird, right? Because it feels like it should apply everywhere, but some states do have kind of a clear line of whether you are responding in a professional capacity versus in your personal life. It looks like somebody said you are required to report.
I also remember that that is not hard and fast. Again, we can try to follow up with with Laura. I wish she was here, because if it's not actually applying to children that are under your care, whether or not that is your mandate, I would say that everyone has a legal and a moral responsibility to prevent child sexual abuse. And my personal and professional opinion is to report any and all child abuse. Someone says that teachers in Colorado have been held liable. So yeah, people are going to want to look that one up and not take it from us. But I'm going to say that you report all child abuse if you hear, whether you're a mandated reporter or not, or whether those children are under your care or not. That's our community-wide approach. Is anyone else having trouble filling in the survey? I see that in the questions as well. We will also put a link to the survey in our follow-up email with our resource guide that we're going to send following this webinar, and we highly appreciate any and all feedback.
Oh, they figured it out.
Oh, great. Thanks to everyone who came out here today, and thanks to Hema for our translation, and to Katie, our host, Angelica, my wonderful co-host, and Kirsten for helping us manage the questions and survey responses.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up today. Again, feel free to visit our website, thebluebench.org, to learn a little bit more about what we do, our community education programs. Again, feel free to visit our Rise Survivor art show to learn more about our community initiative. And yeah, if you all have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at communityed@thebluebench.org. And I think that will be the end of our webinar. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you in June.
Thanks, everyone.